Hej. Velkommen tilbage. Welcome back to the Emil channel or whatever. And today we're going to be talking about Muslims because it's our favorite topic and because, Europeans and stuff. So we're going to do this study that, how do I make this go away? Is it like this? Whoops. And we'll make me maybe this size. Yes, so we're basically begin talking about the Belgium study that came out in Mankind a few months ago, like this. This is how the Mankind quarterly front page cover looks like, and the study is here, and you can pause the video if you want to read the abstract, but we're going to be going over everything it says, so I'm not going to bother reading it. And this is kind of how like Belgium wants itself to be looked at least if you go to Google and you search Brussels, the capital of Belgium, and you get something like this. That's how they want to be perceived. We are, however, going to go a lot further. So if we are taking our sociologist glasses on, and I don't mean thinking about things in Marxist terms, I mean looking at it as a social unit. Belgium essentially looks like this. It has a bunch of divisions, has 10 provinces, 43, whatever these arrondissements, I don't know how the French say this, and about 600 communes or municipalities. And if we color them and put them on a map, it looks something like that. And so these are units we're going to be talking about in this study. So the study as such has two parts. One part is about the capital, that's Brussels, is just these ones here in the middle. And then the second part of the study, we're going to be zooming out to all these. And why do we care about Brussels? Well, one interesting thing about Brussels is that, well, as we'll come to, is that, we're just going to backtrack a bit. Capitals tend to be wealthy compared to the countryside. And if we look around Europe, here's some random map I found of European countries. And essentially, if you look at the region where the capital is, if you know where the capital is, then you'll see that insofar as this color scheme is concerned, it will be usually be a bit more wealthier. So in Finland, the Finnish capital is about here, Helsinki. In Sweden, the capital is here, and there's a very large city here, Göteborg, and over here is Stockholm. In Denmark, the capital is right here. There's a small green one here, so it's also wealthier. Berlin, it's wealthier than the surrounding one. And in France, it's in this Île-de-France, like the earth of Paris, or the earth of France or something. I don't know what it means. And in the UK, it's over here. The reason Ireland is weird is that there's a bunch of like tax laundering sort of thing going down here. I'm pretty sure that Oslo is much more wealthy than the rest of over here. In Spain, we have the capital here, and we have another quasi-capital here, Barcelona area, and this is the Basque region also has its own sort of quasi-capital. Here we have Rome, and so on. You can keep going, but essentially get the idea that there's another one here. The capitals regions tend to be more wealthy. However, this is how it looks like in Belgium, and what we have here is that we have the year on the x-axis, and on the y we have the wealth index, and that's the income of. Let's make me smaller here. Whoops. Well, it's a bit stupid. Anyway, it's the income level of Brussels compared to the rest of Belgium. And so what we see, if we go back to the 70s or so, Brussels area was about, I don't know, 1.5 times as rich as Belgium as countryside, or the rest of Belgium. And but now it's more like 80% as rich. So what happened, right? There was a massive decline of the Belgium capital, and it no longer is wealthy compared to the country, which is weird if we looked at the map I just showed. And these are the regions just in the surrounding neighborhood. So we can see that it's Brussels itself, not just the Brussels area. Because like the regions were just outside of Brussels in terms of this map. So like these regions, those are the ones on the other line, right? They're not getting less wealthy. They're in fact slightly increasing a little bit. So that there's kind of a mystery here, right? And so that's what we're going to be talking about in this study. And so these are the two analyses that I mentioned. We have the city districts. So these are the communes inside of Brussels, and then we have the rest of the country. And for the city districts, it's a lot easier to get data. So we were able to get a bunch of data, 22 different measures, and that are very varied. For the rest of the country, it was much more difficult, and that's because in Belgium, it's kind of three countries in one, sort of, and that's because there's the Brussels part, which speaks two languages, it's bilingual. Then there's the Dutch part, the Flemish, and they speak Dutch, and then there's the French part, and they speak French. And there's also a tiny German part, but essentially it means that the country is kind of subdivided, and the statistics of the entire country are not made by one unit. They're made by these three different units, and you have to go to each of them. And then if they don't collect the same data or they don't publish it or whatever, as you can see, it's a bit of some kind of a, what do you call this? Treasure hunt to find these data. And also for me, of course, since I don't speak Dutch or French, it's a bit more difficult, right? Whatever the case, let's talk about Muslims. So if you take a map of Muslims, you get something like this, and this is the percent of Muslims that are in countries according to Pew Research, and so it's probably fairly PC. And you can see it's more or less the Middle Eastern world, with some exceptions. They have been going into Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, this is kind of like Arabic influence, all this, and then there's some of them here in these, but these are very sparsely populated areas. There's a lot down here in Somaliland, and then it's kind of growing down this way. As I recall, there's a bunch of Muslim trade that kind of went here, at least historically, and some slaves and stuff. Then somehow they spread over here to South Asia, and there's Bangladesh here, which used to belong with Pakistan over here, back when these were one unit. So basically India itself here is mostly non-Muslim, and there's some Muslims, but they're mostly up here. But they used to be all part of the same British India or whatever. So I don't actually know why there's Muslims here. Maybe someone else in the comments will say. That being said, we have the big problem is that European countries, or most other countries, they refuse to collect data on the religion of the citizens. So it's actually very difficult to figure out what the Muslim patterns are. And you could view this as, if you want a benign interpretation, the benign interpretation is that the European government statistics organizations were not, they're set up in the 80s, or maybe in Denmark, for instance, they're set up, I don't know, more than 100 years ago. And back then there was 0 Muslims in Denmark, more or less. So why would you collect data on Muslims? And there's institutional slowness in collecting data that's relevant. And so they basically never started collecting ethnic data, and they don't collect religious data. And you get some kind of religious data. For instance, in Denmark, you get members of the state church. But then if you count people who are not members, these can be foreigners, atheists, people who just don't like the mainstream church, like some kind of heretic Christians or some, East Orthodox, whatever. And some of them will be Muslims. And a bunch of atheists will also be members of the Danish church, and that's because they want to preserve the old buildings and so on. Anyway, so one way you can try to do it is that countries usually do publish some kind of citizenship data. And if you get these for Belgium, they look like this over time. And so what we've done here is that we get each citizen in each commune for each year. So you get a very large data set. And you multiply that by the origin country of Muslim. So if one unit has 10% Turks, you look up Turkey. Turkey is 98% Muslim. Okay, so you now estimate that there's 5% Muslims in this one unit. Then you simply do the same dot product with every other origin that is in this commune, and then you end up with this plot. And we can see the big problem. We can see the big problem here is that supposedly the numbers are declining, and we know the numbers are not declining, so there's something completely wrong. And we can see, for instance, the one big one here used to be like 40%, and now it's like, I don't know, 15% over here, 40%. And in fact, this real number is more like up here, like still at 40 or maybe more, because it's one of the like Muslim areas of Brussels. And what's really happening is that they're changing citizenships, and so the first ones are converting to Belgian citizenship, and the first generation ones, and the second generation or the third generation kids, they are born with Belgian citizenship and therefore are not included anymore. And so we're not really looking at Muslims as such here. We're looking at foreigners that kind of kept their original citizenship, and so that's not really what we want to estimate. We prefer one that keeps to the truth. So what to do? Well, it turns out here we're lucky. There's this guy, Jan Hertogen, I don't know how to pronounce it, and he's Dutch, Flemish, and Dutch Belgian, and so he also knows about this problem, and he decided to adjust for this. And I don't exactly understand his method, but essentially he starts with the same citizenship data, and he keeps track of the birth records, and you can try to see how many people are changing citizenships, and then you change them back, and then you essentially multiply by the Pew Muslim by origin numbers, whatever the case. He came up with these numbers, which look a lot more realistic. And what we see here is that there's mostly stability with many of these districts that are more than 40% or more than 20% Muslim. They're essentially staying that amount of Muslim. They probably should be going up a little bit, but at least they're not rapidly declining, which we know is obviously incorrect. And we see that there's some increase in the remaining of the country. And so on average, if you take a weighted mean of the population size of each line here, you get this red line. That's the country that's slightly going up. Hard to see here, but it is going up. And if you compare this red line with the numbers published for Belgium by Pew, who relied on I don't know what they relied on, some other data, it seems fairly accurate, even though probably not super accurate. And here it should also be said that this guy is actually a big socialist, and he's compiling these data in order to prove how essentially how the far right is wrong about Muslims, and there's not so many of them. So you may quibble about his motivations, is weird, but nice of him to make these data public. He has a blog here, and it only talks in Dutch. So if you're a Dutch speaker, I recommend you go read there and see if you can figure out exactly what he's doing. That being said, let's go to the article. So here we're looking at the city districts, and what we're looking at the city district data, and what we're actually looking at here is that we're looking at the factor analysis of those 22 indicators. And so the 22 indicators are here, and the factor loading, that's the relationship to this general factor of socioeconomic status, or general socioeconomic status, or whatever you want to call this. Well-being is a current popular euphemism, and or neologism. And what we essentially see, though, is that everything that's good has a strong positive loading, and everything that's bad has a negative loading. And so there's a very pure division between these units of Brussels. Like the units of Brussels that have higher rates of blood donors are the same ones that have high wealth and high income, and this and so on, right? Have fewer humanities people. And these are the opposite ones, are the ones that have high unemployment and crime and stuff like that. And it doesn't really matter how you analyze this. I use 3 different methods here. Standard is you take all these units, the 19 units, and you pretend they're the same sample size, and you just analyze them. With weights, you weigh them by population size, so the square root of population size, and it gives the green dots here. And with ranks, you take the rank order versions of all these data before you fractionalize them. And what this does is it removes the effect of outliers, right? Because if you have some variable where some unit is like 5 standard deviations beyond all the other ones, then it's gonna maybe mess up your statistics, depending on how you're thinking about these things. Whatever the case, you can see that across these 3 methods, it didn't do any difference here, right? If we then plot the, I'm too large. Can we make me small? Okay. If we then take this factor score of each of these 19 units, and we take the Muslim percent as given to us by this Dutch guy, then we get this beautiful correlation of minus 0.94, which has to be the strongest demographic prediction I've ever seen in any study. So naturally, I didn't actually believe it was true, so I went back and I double checked and triple checked and so on, but it seems to be just true. And so you can see that the typical ones you hear about in the media that are bad, these are the ones in the bottom of the screen here. You have Molenbeek and Schaerbeek and Saint Joseph, blah, blah, blah. So these are the typical Muslim ones that you see in the media with prayer on the streets and this sort of thing. And the ones you don't see are these ones, the rich ones. And if you put it on the map, it looks like this. And so we basically see, a strange thing is that we see in the southeast part of Brussels, that's where the wealthy people live. It's more red, that means higher social status here. And kind of in the middle and the west here, that's where the Muslims live, right? So you don't want to go there. And over here we have the Muslims, right? So this social status in the Muslim one, but we know they're correlated 9-4 in the, how do we go back? We know they're correlated 9-4, so they're going to be more a kind of a mirror image, right? And it's kind of interesting because normally the rich people live up here because the Dutch part of Belgium is wealthier than the Flemish part, or than the French part, and the French part is down to the south. So these wealthy people live actually closer to the French speakers, even though a lot of these will actually be probably Dutch speakers. So they should kind of be living up here. I don't know exactly why things are like this. Maybe the Dutch were more welcoming to foreigners to begin with, and now that's why the Dutch areas have been taken over first. You can kind of see some of the names. I don't know. This is a French name. Kökelberg is probably a Dutch name. This is a Dutch name. I don't know. Someone will tell me in the comments. Anyway, so what you have is you have the S loading in the bottom, and that's the relationship of each indicator to this general factor. And on the y-axis, we have the relationship of Muslim to each indicator. So what you see, each dot here is a correlation between whatever it is you're seeing and the Muslim. So for instance, if we're looking at this fraudulent declarations, we can see that the proportion of people that have of insurance, I think is declared fraudulent, it has a correlation of 0.6 something, 0.67 or whatever with percentage Muslims. And but things like unemployment rate has a correlation more than 9.5 with Muslims. Yeah. So when you have a small r, it means it's reversed, right? And so what we see is that the things that are more strongly related to the general social status are the same things that are more strongly related to being Muslim. And so this is kind of fingerprinting of the cause, right? Because if actually Muslim is not causal, but it's related to something else, population density, say, or old people, age, or whatever, then you wouldn't expect to find this pattern. You'd expect to find kind of a flat line here, because if the true cause is something unrelated to Muslims, then this would not necessarily look like this. Actually, no one has proven that the Jensen method kind of works as this causal identification. So I am thinking about doing a simulation study to prove that. But currently, that's the intuition. And so it's hard to explain away the relationship if it appears to be causal by this kind of indicator. So why is it that the things that are most strongly related to other things of social status are the same things that are more strongly related to Muslims? That's what this chart shows. And so it's kind of a smoking gun of the cause. Anyway, we can also look at it in natural units. And the reason we want to do that is because the S factor, if you look at this plot, we can see that the S factor, it has scores that go from -2 to 2 up here. But -2 and 2, what does that mean? It's just an arbitrary metric, right? And so that's just in standard deviation. So we see that the least Muslim units have about 2 standard deviations more social status, but that's in relative speaking to these 19 units. So that doesn't really tell you how much income that compares to, right? So what you can do is that you can do a regression model instead. And here we did 4 regression models. And if we want to do the simple one, we're looking at median income. And so the median income of a district, we want to predict this from the proportion of Muslims. And if you try this, you get a model that explains about 80% of the variance. And so the correlation will be 8.5 or something like this. And what you get is that the intercept is 23,000 euros. And so the intercept will be the same value as if you had 0 Muslims. And so the median income of the rich parts here will be 23,000 euros. And this may include like kids. That's why the value is so low compared to other medium incomes you may have seen. And it's probably also before tax. Whatever the case here. So that means that the one with 100% Muslims, that's the one you do when you just add this Muslim one. And the reason for that is that Muslim is coded as 0 to 1. And so when this is the slope, and so when Muslim is 100%, you add this slope. And so that means you put these two together. And that means that if there was a hypothetical part of Brussels that have only Muslims, the median income would be about 4,000 euros there, which is kind of comparable, as far as I can tell, to the actual median incomes you get in like North Africa, which is where these Muslims are from. So what this value tells us is essentially import the third world, become the third world, just in regression models. And if you do unemployment rate, you get something very similar. You get the unemployment rate should be about 12% if there's 0% Muslims, and it should be more like 8 or 60% if there's 100% Muslims there. And university degree, you get some kind of funny looking stuff, is that there should be about 15% of people should have a university degree if it's 0% Muslims, and minus 15% should have it if it's 100% Muslims. And so how you think of this is, of course, Emil, right? You say it's not possible to have -% university degrees. Yes, that is true. I could have modeled it using something other than linear regression. Maybe I should have modeled it using beta regression or something. But essentially what it's saying is that this is kind of the university level you expect. And you could think of it as if you had to had Muslims with university degrees, such as they currently exist, you would have to kind of lower the bar to raise the value. You can interpret it whatever you want. It's kind of just it's just for showcasing to kind of get a perspective of how this works. And in terms of this socioeconomic status, the effect size is about 7.5 standard deviation, and so that's the difference if you go from 0 to 100. And this is completely consistent with this plot, because here you see that going from 0 would be about here. That is 1.5 maybe a standard deviation, 1.5 z-score of social status, and going over here, that's only 45, so you'd have to go another screen over here, right, to get, and then that value you will get at, if you keep drawing this yellow line all the way down until you hit 100% on the x-axis, that value you'll get is this value, or something like that. So this 1.5 is the value on the right, and over here you should get that value. That's the slope, right? So you have to plus these two. Anyway, so that's how much worse it is having this more Muslims, right? 7.5 standard deviation. That's an insane effect size, right? Anyway, so what we really want is that we kind of want to go to the national situation. Maybe there's something very wrong with looking at the data just in Brussels. We want to kind of zoom out. Does this story fit for the entire country also? And what you do here instead is we have 8 measures only instead of 22. We have some more income stuff: inequality, crime rate, violent crime rate, life expectancy, proportions, blah, blah, blah. We do the same kind of fact analysis that we did before, kind of like this one. I did it also, and I'm just not including the plot because it shows more or less the same. This pattern is still stable. There's still one clean general factor. Anyway, if we plot this on the map, we get this plot, and here we see Brussels is somewhere around here. These dark spots here, that's the bad part of Brussels. This part here is kind of the wealthy part of Brussels, I think, and these are some surrounding areas that are kind of wealthy. This is some other Dutch area, Flemish city, and I think this one is also Brabant, as we can see down here, is kind of poor, and over here there's some Germans. I don't know what's here, is maybe some more Muslims. Whatever the case, down here, I think, if you're wondering, as I recall, it's because Luxembourg is here, and some of the EU bureaucrat-like people, they live in Belgium instead of over here, so they kind of commute. So you get a similar pattern here, like this, with I think Virginia in the Virginia state in the U.S., because some people who work in D.C., the capital, they live in Virginia, and so you can get this like strange looking. Anyway, if you look at the Muslims, it looks like this. And so we have a bunch of ones in Brussels here, and essentially Muslims don't live in the countryside. They just live in random, they live in these city areas, mostly like not exactly a slum, but working class areas in cities, or areas that were built for the native working class, or at least foreign working class, whatever. So these are where the Muslims are. And if you do a regression plot, so what I've done here is that we weigh by population size, and I've just colored them by these regions, but it has no function. And we see that over here, this is all the non-Muslim parts, essentially, of Belgium, and they have a big spread in terms of social status. And once you go over here, it starts getting very low, and you get this regression line. And it has a downward slope, and the correlation is minus 0.40. And so you should not be confused by this value being smaller than the one before. And the reason for that is that there's a lot of difference between city regions and other regions. Of course, the most obvious one is population size, and there's some age patterns and so on. And so you would not expect the same correlation. The correlation only tells you about the strength as such in explaining the variation in one from another variable. But if you know there's also there's more other variables that cause variation in the outcome, in this case the general factor score, then this is not the correct value. What you want to look at is a slope, like how many standard deviations or income, whatever, does it get worse going from 0 to 100% Muslims. And so we do the same thing as before. We do regression models, and I've fit 3 different ones with increasing numbers of covariates, things that you may or may not want to control for. And so in the first one, we're predicting the S factor. And what we see is that if you have 0% Muslims, your S factor score will be 0.27 or 0.3 compared to about 1.5 before, and that was for the other parts of Brussels. But these numbers are not necessarily on the same scale because they were calculated using different variables, right? Anyway, interesting, the slope we got before, minus 7.5, now we get minus 8.1, which is quite close, considering, right? It's only 0.5 from, or not that many percent even. So we get a quite similar value despite having these very different units when we look at the slope. If we then add, what do we do here? Okay, yeah, we add age and population density as controls, and we add them as like non-linear controls, and you can interact them and this sort of thing. But we don't care about the estimates for these. We just want to include them. Yeah. When you do that, the coefficient goes down to minus 13, which is interesting. You control for other factors, and the slope becomes larger, not smaller. And so it seems that the slope. So what happens here is that essentially the other things that explain social status were negatively associated with Muslims, and so when you kind of control for them, you're making Muslims look even worse because they actually had the good fortune of living in a wealthy area of the city instead of living in the countryside. Anyway, you can also do what's called the S lag here, and S lag is a spatial lag, and so this is a very strong way of controlling for things you haven't observed. And so the spatial lag is that you take all the neighboring units of the country, you take each unit, and you predict the social state of that unit just by averaging the three closest neighboring units. And so you kind of get the average of the three closest neighbors, and you include that in a regression model. And what this does is that you control for essentially things that neighbors have in common, but you don't necessarily know what they are, but they probably predict as. And this way is a very strong way of controlling for things that you haven't seen. So you don't need to measure everything that could confound these results, because these things are likely to be spatially correlated, concentrated in some regions, because no matter what confounder you're thinking of, it probably has a very strong spatial correlation and spatial autocorrelation, because everything that's closer on a map tends to be similar. And you can basically use this similarity of things that are close on the map to control for things you haven't seen in a regression model. It's very clever, not my idea, so don't give me any accolades for using this. Anyway, when you do this, the value here goes down back, or we could say goes up to 8.8. So it stays close to this one, and again close to the minus 7.5 we got in the symbol analysis. And so we see that even controlling for a bunch of stuff, the kind of over controlling here for stuff we haven't seen, this coefficient keeps being extremely large and extremely significant. These 3 dots means it's less than 1 in 10,000 probability. That's the p-value, less than 1 in 10,000. If we instead use the median income to get an understanding in a more intuitive level, what we get here is that if we just want to predict the income, we get this one. So if we have 0 Muslims, the income should be about 19 euros. And then again, this is median income, so includes, I think, kids, and that's why it's low compared to other like GDP per capita or some other stuff like this. And if you add this value to that value, you get the expected value if Muslims are 100% of the population. And so it basically halves the country income if you were to do it here. And that's the simple control, but you don't have any age and stuff. So that's why this slope is smaller compared to the one you only saw in Brussels. And just like here, when we add age and population density as controls, then the slope becomes more negative. And so essentially you get, it would be about 17,000 before, but if you add these, it goes back down to about 4,000. Again, as I said before, that's similar to incomes you get in North Africa. And so this is not really surprising. If we then control for a bunch of other stuff, so again, like before, we take all the neighboring countries, we take their incomes, we average, not all of the neighbors, we take the 3 neighbors, closest neighbors, and we average their incomes. We use this in the prediction model to kind of control for things we haven't seen that probably predict income. Then we get this value. We go down to negative incomes for Muslims. This should probably be interpreted as you could interpret it as Muslims are actually having 0 incomes because they're mostly getting transfers, or you could interpret it as we probably controlled too much. Whatever the case, this value stays very strong, and that's what I want to show here. Controlling for this is probably overcorrecting. And so in statistics, preferably you would control for every confounder and none of the colliders. But in reality, you don't know which are the confounders and which are the colliders. So you just kind of have to try a bunch of stuff and see if your values seem to be fairly robust. So in this case, we see that this value is still quite small, and there's, or small. Well, I mean, it's quite large and negative. So you going to 100% Muslims is not making it a lot better. Many people are interested in the crime rate. Here we have the crime rate. If there was 0 Muslims, the crime rate would be about 33% lower. That's what this regression indicates. And if you have 100% Muslims, it would be free, or it would be about 280% higher than current. Or if you had 0 and you want to compare 0 and 100% Muslims, you have to divide these two numbers, and so it would be more like 6 times higher, or something like that. So you can say if you imagine a Belgium counterfactual, right, with 0% Muslims and one with 100% Muslims, a Belgium with 100% Muslims, essentially the crime would be 6 times higher, insofar as this regression is concerned. Maybe the Muslims, if they take over the party, they're going to completely change the crime law to cut off people's hands and stuff like that, and maybe the crime rate won't go so high. Whatever exactly the case, that's what the numbers indicate. If we control for age and population, we see that the values become smaller here, and the reason I think for this is that people in cities are a lot younger, and so the confounding factor here is age, because younger people commit more crime and younger people have more Muslims around them. And so when you control for age, you're removing some of these effects that were incorrectly ascribed to Muslims, and the slope goes down to 2.14. So the difference here between these will be the effect of Muslims. So about presenting this is a perfect way to control stuff, it will be about twice as criminal with only Muslims. And if we then also control for this spatial lag, then we kind of go back to value over here, but less extreme. So we still get that going Muslims makes about twice as criminal, but if you had 0 Muslims, it's more like three times compared to 0. So depending on how you want to do this, and it's not exactly clear which way, but no matter which way you do it, you still get a large value here, which is that having more Muslims in some unit makes the crime rate higher. And it's totally unsurprising, of course, because we know that from individual level statistics that Muslims have much higher crime rates. So that's not so surprising. Anyway, so now let's go to the part where we speculate about why Muslims are bad. And we know from many other studies that I've been doing and others have been doing that Muslims don't do well in any country they go to. And but especially they don't do well when it's these kind of unselected, non-elite Muslims that come to mostly Western countries as kind of asylum seekers or some other kind of economic immigrant. And so we have very similar issues. And what I've done here is that this is another study of Denmark that's going to come out very soon. I think the next Mankind Quarterly in more like 1 month or so. And so we have had here is you have the grade point average in the Danish schools, and we have the Muslim origin on the x-axis, and we can see that the countries with fewer Muslims, they have better grades. And that's just one example. The correlation is not that strong. That's because there's a bunch of the blue here means first generation. As first generation, people who don't speak Danish properly, they get understandably worse grades in Danish schools. And so you can also control for that, but the whole point of this is just to illustrate, right? So we want to answer why do Muslims do so poorly. I'm going to put myself down here. And one obvious reason that the mainstreamers don't talk about is, of course, the bad cognitive skills, or compared to Western standards, the bad cognitive skills, but compared to world standard, average, like Muslim average cognitive skills, right? And in Belgium, we have different sources that we can look at here. In particular, I have here the PISA tests from, I believe it's 2015, and there's maybe also some 2012 data. Maybe I didn't put the correct label here. Whatever the case, we see that when we look at these are the natives, these are the immigrants, and we can see there's a quite large gap here. And for the second generation, once it's 100 points, that's more than one standard deviation here. Some 90 points or something like this. And it doesn't matter which topic, if it's math, science, problem solving is kind of a Raven test, and that PISA has kind of remade. Reading, So you can't say it's language bias because this test is mostly abstract and non-lingual, and it still has large gaps. It's actually, this gap is a bit larger than this one. If you look at the French areas, there's a large gap. It's even 40 points here is the smallest one maybe we'll find, these ones. But that's because the French natives are not as smart as the Dutch Belgians. In the Dutch party, the gap is larger, and the German area, the gap is also larger. So essentially what you see is that the IQ gaps here are quite normal, and since we know that IQ is related causally to social status and crime and all these things, it's unsurprising that that this pattern exists. And one other way, the better way to do this is actually to have individual level data where you have whether someone is Muslim, and you have their, not just whether they're Muslim, but which kind of Muslim and how serious their Muslimness is, how religiously extreme they are. And then you'd have the income, preferably from the state register. And then you'd also have IQ from the army test or something like this. And as far as I know, no such data set exists that can do this. Or if it exists, it must be private. At least I can't find it. I've been looking for a number of years. Anyway, recently I discovered this 2007 paper that is very important, but not very widely known. So here we'll be talking about it. It's the income gap between natives and second generation immigrants in Sweden. And so here's the abstract. I'm going to make myself disappear. And Nordin and Roth or whatever, this is the abstract, and the key part here is once the result of the Swedish military enlistment test, that's the draft test, is controlled for, the income gap almost disappeared for second generation immigrants with both parents born in Southern Europe or outside Europe. So Southern Europe, outside Europe, that's their way of talking about non-Westerns. So they've kind of grouped the non-Westerns with the Southern Europeans, and I don't know why they do this, but of course these are Swedish-ish researchers, so use whatever answers you have for why Sweden is cocked. And so this seems to be the case, but why it's important is that they're using second generation immigrants here, and so language ability is not a problem because these are all second generations. These all speak Swedish as a native language, maybe also something else, but they at least speak Swedish, and they grew up in Sweden and they went to Swedish schools and so on. So anything you can, any kind of immigrant factor, it's gone away, right? Because we know from other studies that cognitive gaps and so on, they don't go any better in the third generation, and I don't think anything else goes better in the third generation compared to the second, except confounding from what do you call this, delusion, it's seen in the US, whatever the case. So focusing on second generation makes sense because of this factor. And what they find is that most of the difference goes away. Unfortunately, this paper doesn't have any good graphs. I would have shown the graphs, but they have a bunch of boring tables that are hard to read. So unfortunately, you're just going to have to go read that paper if you want details. As I recall, it's about 70 to 80% or so of the income gap goes away when you control mostly for this IQ test that was taken many years prior. And so what I'm saying here is that Muslims, when they do not so well in Europe, it's mostly an intelligence gap. It's mostly an intelligence gap, not necessarily only an intelligence gap, but mostly. And there can be other factors. And for the remaining factors, I would point to things having to do with weird psychology. And by weird psychology, I mean, the Germanic sort of lacking inbreeding, pro-social honesty, this sort of thing, high, low level of corruption. This sort of mentality fosters higher social status. And of course, everybody outside kind of this, outside the Hasnell line has low value of this kind of weird mentality. And if you want to read more about that, you can go read the Joe Henrik book, The Secret of Our Success and The Weirdest People in the World. I highly recommend these. But I think the last, say, 20% of the income gap has to be explained by some of these factors. Another way to look at it is this kind of data from Denmark that are very juicy. And what we have here is we have the IQ data from the army test in Denmark. So these are taken mostly by, I think, second generation immigrants. And we have the socioeconomic status. Unfortunately, the socioeconomic status here is also including the first generation people. And so these data are a bit mismatched because the socioeconomic status is depressed by the first generation proportion, but the army test is not. So maybe this explains some of this regression line. I mean, in a perfect world, this regression line would go through these Muslim names down here, but it doesn't. It goes over here. So there seems to be something pulling the Muslims down aside from lower IQ, and that may be some of these weird psychology stuff, or it may just be this bias of my data set. I can't really tell with this data because these data, I only have the group level data. I only have the average by name. I don't have specific individuals data. These are all kind of hidden. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to figure out what these non-intelligence Muslim problems are because there's very little kind of honest research on this topic. Most of it is like very stupid, dumb sociology stuff where we control for parental education and then pretend this is causal, something like that. It is possible that Muslims, for instance, have less interest in academia. This is a typical, this kind of academic interest or academic aspirations is typically invoked in, say the soft bigotry of low expectations. In the US, it's actually false because Africans actually have very high expectations of themselves, but they just don't attain them. But it could be that Muslims in Europe basically come here and they want to say, no, look, a farmer's life is good enough for me. I want to make pizzas the rest of my life. Whatever the case, that could be the case, but someone just needs to do a study where you control for this interest in education. The whole idea is if you have a larger interest in education, you get a better education, and then you make more money, right? And it could also be a kind of hostility towards native Europeans, but it doesn't really explain why you're not making money, because you don't need to like Europeans to make more money doing business, right? You could just do business and still you can give all your money to, the local mosque or whatever, right? Or like terrorism, I don't know. Whatever the case, the hostility towards native Europeans would explain a higher crime rate, but it wouldn't explain why your income is lower, right? Bad work ethics, are they just more lazy? Again, we have stuff like the Protestant work ethic. I would say I'm pretty sure that Europeans have better work ethics than most other people. But I mean, it's very difficult to measure this sort of thing, and you can do obvious things like measuring the number of hours people work, but that depends on like self-reporting numbers of hours correctly. And like many people just work a lot, but actually are extremely lazy at the job, so they have very low productivity. And it's actually very difficult to actually measure work ethic. So maybe the fact that we don't have good measures here is not so much as an indictment of this particular research, just like it's difficult to measure. It could also be Islamic beliefs themselves, like maybe believing more in like the gloriousness of Islam and Allahu Akbar, whatever stuff. Maybe that itself kind of makes you kind of seek an inner world, and you don't want to make so much money from education or from income and so on. I don't really know. This kind of vague cultural explanation is typically given, and people cite like stuff from the Quran, and they say this is why Muslims don't do well. Essentially, it's just baseless speculation at this point. But since, of course, research has to start somewhere, I'll take space speculations as a good starting point, along with these other things. And it could also be some other Islam-related stuff that's totally not Islam. I don't know. Preferably what we want is that we want like a large data set with say 10,000 people, and we measure all these things at once, and we measure their income and intelligence levels and education levels and blah, blah, blah. We in fact get these from the state government, the government registers, and then we check. I don't think such a data set exists. You couldn't even buy it because typical poll data, survey data, you can't really just survey immigrants because first generation people, they don't really read English or Danish or German or whatever. You have to do it halfway in Arabic, so you have to translate it there to Arabic. But then you have the problem that they don't really like to fill out surveys, and you get survey bias. You're getting like the best immigrants are kind of responding to a survey, and you'd have to send out people in the ghetto to interview them face to face. And then there's the problem of lying on surveys, because why would you tell this nice survey lady that you really believe in Islam and behead the foreigners or whatever? I mean, how are you supposed to get this data? It does not seem really practical, and that's really why we don't have more good answers on this topic. It's because these data just either cannot be gotten or I don't have them. And since very few other people kind of want to look at it in this way, then nothing much happens. So to summarize this video and this study, the study itself is quite long, like, I don't know, 50 pages. So you should maybe read that. It has a lot more graphs that you can be enjoying. So the summary, we have 6 points, 7 points, and you can find, if you actually try to look, you can find quite detailed subnational data and even foreign languages, because what you can do is that you can go to Google and you can say file type colon, and you can say, for instance, XLSX, and that only gives you Excel files. And you can say, you can go to Google also, you can find the names of the Belgian units, so you can find 5 different names of these Belgian communes, and you put those in Google, and so you're basically saying, Google, find me spreadsheets that have these names of these Belgian units. And then you can go to Google Translate, you put income or something, you get the Belgian word or the French or the Dutch or both words for this, and you put that also. You're finding now spreadsheets that have these units at least mentioned, and that also has income mentioned somewhere, right? When you do a bunch of this combinations, you can find a bunch of weird data sets that even natives don't know about, or even the official statistics people don't know where to find. But this is kind of one weird trick to get data, even when you can't read the language. What we found also is that we get the typical S-factor pattern. Positive things go together with other things that are positive. Higher education are the same regions that have higher life expectancies, are the same regions with low unemployment, and so on. There is some kind of general well-being or development factor or whatever. So it seems also that this would probably have the implication there's likely to be common cause of this stuff, which is very strongly related to Muslim, and I would say probably to intelligence. The S factor is very strongly correlated to intelligence and demographics. In this study, we unfortunately did not have intelligence scores by commune. And in fact, we applied to the Belgian army to get these from the draft, because they do have a draft test, or they did until recently. But they told us it would be unethical to get this data, even though they're actually just an average of each commune. And so I believe this to be actually illegal. So if someone is a Belgian speaker, I would suggest, at least if you have some kind of legal knowledge, or even if you just want to try, then I think we should just keep applying for these data. And if they say it's unethical, I should say, look, do you want to talk to my lawyer? And maybe just this vague threat of a lawyer is enough to make them cough up with the data. I mean, they're hiding something. Why is it unethical if there's nothing to hide? I mean, they're hiding something here. A Muslim percentage here is a very, very strong predictor in Belgium. Like correlation in the among Belgian, the communes of Brussels was 9.4, right? So it's almost a perfect correlation of a Muslim percentage to how much worse a city district is, right? And there are some strong correlations in other countries, but this one has to take the cake as by far the strongest correlation I've ever seen for any demographic correlation. The outcomes of complete Muslimification are very dire. 60% unemployment, median income in a few thousand euros. That's kind of what our models tell us, depending on which, are we looking at the entire country, which controls and whatever. They kind of get fairly consistent answer that this would be the median income of Belgium if we were to move all the non-Muslims out, or just move more Muslims in until they get diluted away or converted. The problem seems to be mostly but not entirely related to intelligence gaps, and that's just because we can see the Swedish study. It's not something we find in this study, it's the Swedish study I just summarized, right? And this is the way the things are going. We know that Muslim percentage is just increasing in all these Western countries, and essentially it looks like it's causal for bad outcomes, and so it seems that nothing is done, so that's just the way the cookie crumbles, right? And with that said, we complete our mission, our video of today's study. I hope to have, the new study should come out in Mankind Quarterly soon, so it'll be 2 more videos. No, there'll be 3 more videos then, and there will be also the one on national IQ stuff. Until then, see you around.